Emma stood on the porch, with her fist raised to knock. 26 years of anger sitting in her chest like a stone, when the door opened before she even touched it. The woman standing there was smaller than Emma had imagined, silver already threading through her dark hair, her eyes widening the second she saw Emma's face. For a moment, neither of them said a single word. They simply stood there, two strangers who shared the same blood, staring at each other across a threshold neither one knew how to cross. Emma had rehearsed this moment for weeks. She had planned exactly what she would say to the woman who gave her away at birth, the woman who signed papers and walked out of a hospital room without ever once looking back. She had planned to ask her, coldly and directly, how anyone could abandon their own child. But standing there now, watching this stranger's hands begin to shake, watching tears well up in eyes that looked disturbingly like her own, Emma felt every rehearsed word disappear from her mind. The woman finally spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have his eyes," she said. "Your father's eyes. I've been waiting 26 years to see them again." Emma's carefully built anger cracked slightly at the edges, because nothing about that sentence matched the story she had believed her entire life. And in the next hour, everything Emma thought she knew about being abandoned was about to be completely rewritten. Welcome to Digital Story Corner. Sit back, relax, and let's begin. Emma grew up knowing she was adopted, from the time she was old enough to understand the word. Her adoptive parents, Frank and Diane, never hid the truth from her, always speaking about her birth mother with a strange, careful gentleness that Emma, as a child, never quite understood. They told her only that her birth mother had been very young, unable to care for a baby, and had made the difficult decision to place her for adoption so she could have a better life. As a small child, Emma accepted this simple explanation without much thought, secure and happy in the only family she had ever known. Frank used to carry her on his shoulders through the backyard every evening after work, and Diane used to sing her to sleep with the same 3 lullabies every single night. And for years, that was simply the whole of Emma's world, warm and complete and entirely enough. But as she grew older, particularly through her teenage years, that simple explanation began to feel less like comfort and more like an excuse. She began to resent a woman she had never met, building an entire narrative in her mind of a careless girl who had simply not wanted the burden of a baby, who had walked away without a second thought, who had never once tried to find her afterward. She remembered sitting in health class in 10th grade, listening to a lecture about responsibility and consequences, and feeling a hot flush of anger rise in her chest, certain the lesson had been written specifically to excuse women exactly like her birth mother. This resentment deepened the day Emma turned 18 and legally requested her original birth records, only to discover a small, strange detail that confused her deeply. Attached to her adoption file was a single knitted baby blanket, pale yellow, clearly handmade, tucked away in storage for nearly 2 decades. A short note pinned to it, written in shaky young handwriting, simply read, "For when she's old enough to know I never stopped loving her." Emma remembered staring at that blanket for a long time, unable to reconcile it with the story she had built in her mind. If her birth mother truly hadn't cared, why keep something like this waiting for her all these years? She folded the note away into a drawer and tried hard not to think about it, telling herself it changed nothing about the fact that she had still been left behind. Over the following years, Emma built a good life for herself. She finished college, built a career in graphic design, married a patient, understanding man named Tom, and eventually gave birth to her own daughter, a bright, curious little girl named Lily. It was watching Lily grow, watching the fierce, immediate love she felt the very first moment she held her own daughter, that Emma's old resentment resurfaced, stronger than ever. She simply could not understand how any mother could feel that same overwhelming love and still choose to walk away. She would sit awake some nights nursing Lily, staring down at her daughter's small, sleeping face, and feel an anger rise in her that had nothing to do with the peaceful child in her arms and everything to do with a stranger she had built an entire villain out of in her own mind. That unresolved anger eventually led her to hire a researcher, determined finally to track down the woman who had given her up, needing answers more than she had ever needed them before. It took nearly 3 months, but eventually, Emma had an address in a small town 4 hours from her own home. She drove there on an ordinary Tuesday morning, rehearsing angry questions the entire way, needing this woman to finally explain herself after 26 years of silence. Standing now on that porch, all of those rehearsed questions forgotten, Emma found herself invited inside a small, modest home, filled with the quiet, careful order of someone who lived simply. The woman, Claire, made tea with trembling hands, and finally began to tell Emma a story that reshaped everything Emma believed about her own beginning. Claire had been 16 years old when she became pregnant, still in high school, living under the strict rule of deeply religious parents who considered the pregnancy an unforgivable shame upon their family. Claire wanted desperately to keep her baby, begged her parents repeatedly for any alternative, but ultimately had no legal power at 16 to make that decision against their will. Her parents arranged the adoption entirely themselves, forced her to sign papers under threat of being disowned completely, and made absolutely certain that any future contact between Claire and her daughter would be permanently impossible. Claire remembered sitting in that lawyer's office, 16 years old and utterly powerless, watching her own mother sign documents on her behalf while she was made to wait outside in the hallway. Claire told Emma, voice breaking, that she had specifically requested to hold her only once before the adoption was finalized. And that single memory had stayed with her every single day for the past 26 years. She described Emma's tiny fingers wrapping around her own, the particular weight of her in her arms, a memory she said she had replayed in her mind so many times it had worn perfectly smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket for decades. She told Emma that the nurse who took the baby from her arms that day had been kind enough to let her keep one small photograph, the only image she had of her daughter for the next 18 years, until the day she finally learned Emma had requested her own records. What came next in Claire's story was the part that broke Emma completely open. Claire explained that despite her parents' strict rules, despite having no legal right to any contact, she had spent years quietly finding out everything she could about the family who adopted her daughter. She had learned, through a sympathetic social worker who took pity on a heartbroken 16-year-old girl, the town where Emma's adoptive family lived. And over the following years, whenever she could scrape together enough money for a bus ticket, Claire would make the 4-hour trip alone, simply to stand at a careful distance and watch her daughter's life unfold, without ever once approaching. She had stood outside Emma's elementary school on picture day, watching a small girl in pigtails laugh with friends on the playground. She had sat in the very back row of an auditorium for Emma's 4th grade spring recital, clapping quietly along with strangers, then leaving before anyone could ask who she was. She had stood across the street during Emma's high school graduation ceremony, unable to get a seat inside, watching through an open side door as her daughter walked across a stage she had once only imagined. Claire reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn photo album, handing it to Emma with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since she opened the front door. Inside were dozens of photographs, taken from careful distances over more than 2 decades. Emma at 7, riding a bicycle down her childhood street. Emma at 12, in her middle school band uniform. Emma at 17, laughing with friends outside her high school on the exact day of graduation. Every single photograph was a moment Emma remembered living, never once knowing that a woman she believed had abandoned her had actually been standing somewhere nearby, quietly present for pieces of a childhood she had been legally forbidden from claiming. Emma sat in stunned silence, turning page after page, watching her entire childhood reflected back at her through the eyes of a mother she had spent years believing never cared at all. There was a photograph of her 10th birthday party in the backyard, taken from just beyond the fence line, Claire having learned the date and simply stood outside the property for a few stolen minutes, close enough to hear the laughter, but too afraid to be seen. There was another from the day Emma got her driver's license. Claire parked across the street in an old sedan, watching her practice pulling out of the driveway again and again until she finally got it right. Emma realized, with a wave of guilt that nearly overwhelmed her, that presence does not always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes love is forced into hiding by circumstances entirely outside anyone's control, forced to exist quietly at a distance, rather than not exist at all. Claire explained, tears finally falling freely, that she had never once stopped trying to find a legal way to reach out, writing to adoption agencies repeatedly over the years, only to be told again and again that confidentiality laws prevented any contact unless Emma herself initiated it first. She had spent 26 years quietly loving a daughter from a distance, waiting patiently and painfully for a knock on her door that she genuinely believed might never come. Emma left Claire's house that evening completely changed from the woman who had arrived that morning ready for confrontation. She sat in her car outside for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to drive home, processing decades of misplaced anger, now finally colliding with an entirely different truth. Over the following months, Emma and Claire slowly, carefully, began building the relationship neither of them had ever been allowed to have. It was awkward at times, full of decades of missing context neither woman quite knew how to fill, but it was also, unmistakably, real. They started with weekly phone calls, hesitant and formal at first, gradually softening into the easy, comfortable chatter of two women who genuinely wanted to know each other. Claire began sending small, handwritten cards for every occasion she had missed, birthdays and holidays stretching back further than either of them could count, each one signed simply, "So glad to finally know you." Emma brought Lily to meet Claire for the first time on a quiet Sunday afternoon, watching her own daughter climb happily into the lap of a grandmother she had never known existed. Watching Claire's face light up with a joy Emma finally understood the true weight of. Frank and Diane, when Emma finally told them everything, welcomed Claire into the family with a grace that surprised even Emma, understanding instinctively that love, in this particular story, had never actually been in short supply, only scattered across more people than anyone originally realized. Emma eventually framed one particular photograph from Claire's old album, the one taken from a careful distance at her high school graduation, and hung it in her own home beside a more recent picture of the 3 generations of women finally standing together. She still keeps the pale yellow blanket Claire made all those years ago, no longer folded away in a forgotten drawer, but wrapped now around Lily on cold winter nights, a quiet thread connecting a childhood Emma once misunderstood to a new one she is determined to raise with full and complete honesty. What Emma learned, in the end, was that the loudest conclusions we draw about the people who hurt us are not always the truest ones, and that sometimes the love we assume was missing was simply forced into silence, waiting patiently at a distance for a door that finally, eventually, opened. If this story moved you, subscribe to Digital Story Corner and hit the bell. A brand new story drops every single day.